The world's largest hedge fund, Bridgewater Associates, was founded in 1975 by an American billionaire investor by the name of Mr. Raymond T. Dalio. The firm serves institutional clients including pension funds, endowments, foundations, foreign governments, and central banks with $140 billion under management. Mr. Dalio has also written the book Principles, Life and Work about investment philosophy and corporate management, and many more that are worth reading. An economy is not a complicated thing. It just has a lot of moving parts, but the basic is there's a transaction. That transaction means somebody makes a purchase. They make a purchase of a good, service, or a financial asset. That purchase can be made with money or credit. If money, when you make a purchase with money, you end the transaction. You don't owe anything when you make it with credit, then there's a liability you have to come up with the money because a credit that debt is an obligation to deliver money. They're spending, in other words, the total amount of money and credit spent on a good or service, and then there's the item that you're buying, a stock, a bond, a car, a bushel of wheat, and there's that transaction. Demand is best measured in terms of spending. He thinks in traditional economics is a mistake to measure it in terms of the quantity of goods that is given up in a purchase as money or credit. What we go through is we go through a cycle. Credit can be created. It's not created through the velocity as is commonly believed. It can be created out of thin air. If, for example, I go into a store or have somebody paint my house and I say I'm going to pay you later, I've created credit that'll count in GDP. It'll be an item of production, so what we have is a credit cycle. If there's not much debt, if you don't have much debt, then you have the ability to borrow money. Let's say you earn $100,000 a year and you don't have any debt. You can then borrow $10,000 a year. You therefore can spend $110,000. You're spending $110,000 is somebody else's income of $110,000, so it has a positive effect and you go through a cycle. And through that cycle, you spend $110,000. They earn $110,000 and the cycle becomes self-reinforcing. Through that cycle, debt rises faster than income. So as debt rises faster than income, you have a debt cycle as you guess as it's what causes it to stop. Well, traditionally, as you lower interest rates, it creates three positive effects. If interest rates are too high, then you lower interest rates. Lowering interest rates has the effect of making it easier to service the debt. It has the effect of making items cheaper to buy on credit because the monthly payments are less. It has the present value effect on assets. So if you lower interest rates and you have something that has a cash flow, let's say a piece of real estate, but has a present value effect, it causes those assets to go up. That produces wealth and that allows more borrowing. So when you get to a situation where you can't lower interest rates anymore, say you hit zero, you hit that part of the cycle and so then you go to a deleveraging. Now leveraging means that you can't raise debt ratio income anymore. When you can't raise debt relative to income anymore, the cycle begins to work in reverse. He thinks the people, if they don't do a very good job of calculating incrementally what the effects are on demand, let's say you're having net growth at something like 10 and you go to a 5% net growth instead, that has a negative effect on growth. The marginal change from that level produces a negative effect on growth. So traditionally in deleveraging, that negative effect that happens on, for let's say Europe, is a very classic case. The Spanish banking systems are a very classic case. The European banking system. As the banks leverage up at a certain rate and they can't leverage up more than the rate, they lessen the rate at which they're leveraging it up, it has the effect of beginning a debt deleveraging. Deleveraging means then the income, the spending all produces sort of a negative cycle. That produces the beginning of a depression. A depression is the phase of deleveraging in which there's a combination of austerity and debt reconstructing. Because if you have too much debt to service, you've got to do something about it. When you have too much debt of service and you do something about it, there are a limited number of things that you can do. You can either transfer that debt, you can transfer resources from the rich to the poor, so you can have it transferred, for example, from Germany to Spain. That's one way of dealing it. The other way is to have a combination of austerity and debt restructurings. A debt restructuring means that you lower the debt in one fashion or another. You lower the debt burden to something that you can afford to service because of the income that you produce. Restructurings can take one of three ways. You can either actually write down the debt. Say write it down in half because you can service, half if you service half, but the problem is one man's debt are another man's assets. So when you write it down in half, you have a big negative wealth effect. So if you have a negative wealth effect, you can't borrow money. It has that problem. So restructuring becomes a problem. You could restructure it either in the form of writing it down, or in one way or another, you can lengthen the payments or you can forcibly lower the interest rate. But some way or another, you've got to get the payments in line for what the cash flows are producing so that you can service that kind of debt. There is a very painful process. Depression is the face of deleveraging when there's a combination of austerity and writing down debts. So all the third way you can deal with it is you can print money. Essentially, what we can print money, the printing of money means that essentially a central bank debt is a commitment to deliver money. Now, the best deleveraging are ones in which you have a balance of those things. Ultimately, you have to bring down the debt to income ratio, and the ways that ultimately you'll have a balance of those three things. You're going to have a certain amount of transfer of wealth. Let's call them four things. A certain amount of austerity, a certain amount of debt write-downs, and a certain amount of printing money. The debt write-downs and the austerity are deflationary. The printing of money is inflationary. If you can get the balance right of those things, then you have what he calls a beautiful leveraging. When you look at leveraging the debt to income ratios, thank you. That's good if you look at the debt to income ratios and say how they come down over time in England after World War II, or the United States and the Great Depression, in all of these cases where the debt to income ratios came down. How did they come down? They came down with relatively good conditions by trying to get by that mix. The number one reason is that there's enough of the printing of money that the nominal growth rate in GDP has to exceed the nominal interest rate. Think about it. You have a certain amount of debt and there's a certain debt service cost, and if that interest rate on the debt is higher than the nominal GDP rate, then that means that it's going to compound unless you keep cutting, and that produces a negative consequence. So the most important thing is in leveraging, as the United States is now doing, is that you can have enough printing of money to produce a nominal growth rate that's above the nominal interest rate over a period of time. Now when we then take 2007 and have happened repeatedly in the IMF restructurings, you can go back and study them all. They're all the leveraging, and then they're all classic cases, and they're all pretty simple. 2007 and also in the European case, what we had was rates of debt growth that were unsustainable rates of debt growth. The most common mistake of monetary policy is that it's targeting inflation and growth. While inflation and growth are important, it really what does produce debt, and what it has to pay attention to is debt growth relative to income growth, growth relative to sustainability. And so what happened is, lots of times you have a lot of debt growth that goes into the purchase of financial assets, and that's a classic bubble that's worse, and that's a riskier situation than inflation. Again, an economy is not a complicated thing. It just has a lot of moving parts, but the basics is there is a transaction. So how can we apply this in our day-to-day decision? We have to think twice before making all the decisions, so to speak, in our every transaction to make.